I met a lot of folks who are co-founder dating.
It's not always the case. And when money starts to come in, things get weird. Yeah. Everybody knows that. People get greedy typically and things just change. And so my suggestion would be...
Is there any one or two points that, like, downtimes for you in this journey?
God, it was extremely stressful. It just always seemed like something was gonna put the company out of business, could happen any day. So we were constantly figuring out everything. Finally got to the point where we had a run rate of $1 million a year. I would change our system a lot. Like, we ended up buying a company.
Welcome to Funds and Founders. This weekly show is tailored for Austin founders navigating the early stages of their entrepreneurial journey. I'm your host and fellow Austinite, Abhinav Sinha. If you're looking for the motivation and the insight needed to build a successful company, you're in the right place. Today we have on Stacy. Stacy was an entrepreneur in residence at Curious Minds, Inc., after which she co-founded TeleSign, which was a product of the Incubator, Curious Minds, Inc. She was at TeleSign for quite a while until it was acquired by BICS. BICS.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, she's been an advisor to various startups and is currently working on a stealth company. Welcome to the show, Stacy.
Thank you. Great to be here.
One thing I wanted to ask was, after your MBA, why go and become an entrepreneur in residence? It's not a traditional path. And why choose that path? What excited you about that?
Yeah, definitely not a traditional path at all. I actually didn't get an MBA, so I came straight out of undergrad at USC. I did do a business major with an entrepreneur emphasis, but I definitely did not take a traditional path. So when I graduated, this was the time when people who graduated and didn't know what they want to do with their lives went to law school. So I actually took the LSAT. I was all geared up to go to law school. I worked at a law firm for like 6 months, hated everything about it, and decided that I wanted to do something else. And I had always been sort of a techie person. So I started coding when I was 12 and just sort of taught myself, and ended up seeing this post out in the world. I don't even know where I found it. That was for an incubator. And this was LA. It's not even San Francisco. Yeah. Los Angeles, 2005. An incubator was like a very different type of a thing. It did not have a formula like it does today, but the post was just, come help us build businesses. And to me, that sounded super cool. So I just went in and started chatting with them and ended up joining the incubator. So that's really how it got started. And I was never the kind of person that just felt like I was going to take a traditional path. Well, I guess when I was thinking about going to law school, I was trying to sort of fit myself into a traditional path, but it wasn't for me.
So joining the incubator, what were some of the ideas you tested out? How many ideas were you testing out before you landed on TeleSign?
So we tested out a ton of ideas. TeleSign was actually the first one we started with, but it took a while to take off. So we sort of started TeleSign. They were like, we don't know if this one's going to take off. We're going to work on some other things as well. So we tested, for example, one called Doctors on Demand, which was doctors over phone call, because this was really before you could really do a video call. We tested one called Do My Stuff, which was kind of like TaskRabbit is today, very similar. We did one, I don't even talk about this one very often because it's kind of embarrassing, but we actually did a lot of press for this one and Do My Stuff. It was called Pooch IQ. So it was, if you have a dog, you could do an IQ test on your dog. Yeah. So we did several. There was a few others. I feel like all of these ended up getting made eventually. So it's kind of like, what is that company called where you can sort of have a celebrity say something?
Cameo.
Kind of like Cameo, but it was more like just have a conversation with a celebrity. Yeah. So there was a ton of things that we worked on, but TeleSign was really the one that showed the most revenue potential, to be honest.
If you could pick any one idea or just talk more generally, how were you guys honing down on an idea and then validating the idea? Because there's a lot of ways to go about that.
Yeah.
And wanted to sort of break that down for anyone listening.
I feel like it's become much more of a formula than it was for us back then. So again, this was like 2005, 2006, 2007. So we would just quickly build something, throw it out into the ether. What we would try to do, because this was really before social media, the way that we went after clients, which I guess would be sort of like the validating phase, was different for each one. So like for TeleSign, we sent out a ton of emails. That was our main source of trying to, get feedback from clients, send out emails, see what happened. With, for example, Do My Stuff and PushIQ, we did a lot of press. We went after the press. We would send press releases, and we had whole lists of press people that we would reach out to. For example, with those, what would happen is we get a bunch of press. We get a lot of people coming to the business and either making purchases or using the service. And then we would see like how much revenue are we actually making off of this and how much work are we doing? So for example, PushIQ was very work intensive. It was like you have to pack things up and send it out. With Do My Stuff, we didn't have a good revenue model. We had a really interesting business. We had a lot of people that wanted to use it, but we didn't really know how to make money off of it per se. I would just say we didn't have a specific formula, but we just got a sense after seeing how people interacted with the business and whether we could turn a profit, essentially. That's how we finally made the decision to focus in on TeleSign.
And so when you're doing press, sending emails, have you already built an MVP by then? Are you doing more of what people call like a landing page approach nowadays, where you're just putting up a marketing page with like a sign-up sheet or a waiting list?
So we had very basic MVPs. So for PushIQ, we had the elements of it, but it's not like we had like a manufacturer that we were working with or anything like that. We just had the elements that we would source from like stores, essentially. Yeah. With Do My Stuff, we had an MVP. We didn't build it. It was based on some software that was already available, like a software package that you could use for an eBay or like a classified type of thing that we just customized. So it was not an intensive amount of work that we put into it before we went out to market and got feedback. Now that did cause problems. The site crashed multiple times because we just weren't prepared and it wasn't architected for so much traffic.
Good problem to have.
It was a good problem to have at the time, yeah. And even TeleSign, we actually did quite a bit more work on that one because it was very difficult back then. It wasn't like you could just, set up an account on some website. I don't really want to call out any of our competitors, but like and send like VoIP calls or text messages or whatever. We had to actually hook up to like what was called a PRI line, which is a line from AT&T that came into our office and hooked up to servers that were meant to send calls, because that's how at the beginning we were sending calls rather than text messages. So that one was pretty technically intensive before we could even offer the product.
Makes sense. Quickly taking a step back, so you joined the incubator. Can you quickly describe how the incubator was structured? How many people were there? Was everyone working on all the ideas? Was the goal of the incubator to find one banger idea and like everyone shift gears there, or what was the overall structure?
The structure was very loose, but basically what it was a bunch of resources. So we had several actually, technical resources that we could use there. We had the guy who started it, which was basically our mentor. So he could be thought of as like a business resource. We could bounce ideas off of him. He always had a lot of feedback. So what we had there was resources, and then a few people like myself and Darren, who's one of the co-founders, and Ryan, one of the co-founders, and a few other people who were actually in charge of starting the businesses and using those resources. But it was never going to be like everyone in the incubator would turn and focus on one. It was like a few people who were starting maybe that one would focus then in on one if it started to take off, and maybe we'd pull some resources or maybe not, and then really hone in on that and start building an organization.
Makes sense. Can you talk about the structure and how that worked with the incubator? And what I'm trying to get at is a lot of listeners who are early stage builders get the opportunity to go to a lot of accelerators, incubators, but structures can be very gray, can be very loose. Can you briefly describe what the structure was and what you would recommend in terms of how to best use an incubator?
So again, our structure was very loose. Everything about that incubator was extremely loose, and we were just sort of making things up as we went along. I would say everyone that I worked with there was just a really good person, luckily for me, and we just all got along really well. I'm sure that's not always the case. And when money starts to come in, things get weird. Yeah, everybody knows that. People get greedy typically, and things just change. And so my suggestion would be to have everything really buttoned up and in writing when you go in, know exactly what you're getting into, because you never know what's going to happen. I feel like for us, it was very loose and we had to all come to an agreement, but we were able to do that because we just worked really well together.
It's funny you say that. I have this random story I bring up from my undergrad where a bunch of us friends were doing hackathons and going to accelerators and trying to pitch ideas, make ideas and MVPs. And one of them won. And there was promise of going to a 3-4 month accelerator, 30-40K. And this was back in 2014. And we were in India, so 40K was a lot of money, right? The second that became a thing, it was like, oh, we were 7 people building an idea, but it very quickly became, oh no, but like I want 18%. No, you get 6%. I'm like, how are you making these conclusions?
Yeah.
Because up until now, it was everybody, let's just find an idea that works. But it's funny that if you don't have those things understood, both from a point of view of equity plus cash compensation, plus expectation, right? I work with a lot of founders here who tell me that, hey, my CTO is taking 2 months off.
Okay.
And like this was the arrangement, but I'm like, you don't have anything written in stone. And now you're in a weird situation where you're trying to do sales, but like you need feature dev, but they're not available, but like they own 50%. Like there's a lot of these weird situations.
Yeah.
And if you're not written in stone, it becomes very hard to counteract those battles, right?
100%. The more that you can have written down, the better, because then you can point to that and be like, this was our agreement. Otherwise, you might have an agreement in your head and they have another agreement in their head, and you think you're matched and aligned, but you're not. And once money comes into the picture, people just start grabbing what they can in some cases, and you don't really know what's going to happen. You might think that you know someone really well, but then you don't. So what we did is not what you should do. Like I got lucky, but definitely write things down.
So you guys are testing out the ideas. Some are failing, some are working. What was the turning point for which you guys saw that, okay, TeleSign could be the one?
It's a really good question. I think there was a couple of turning points. One was, so I don't really remember what things I've signed, like NDAs and stuff. So I'm not going to name any of our like actual clients. All the NDAs have probably expired at this point, but just in case. So we started working, I'll just say, with a large classified website. And they were having a lot of fraud-related problems. And, they installed our system for some of the categories, and we would literally watch. We knew what the fraudsters were doing. We knew where they were communicating. And so we would go on these message boards, the black hat message boards, basically, and watch the fraudsters and see what they were saying. Long story short, classified ads company installed our system. It worked for a while. Like they saw the fraud drop tremendously. And then the fraudsters, the scammers, they always adjust and they find new ways to do things. And we saw that they were adjusting and finding ways around it. And so we had to take our technology and make it better. And we did that. And when we did that, we saw, they basically had a meltdown on these message boards. They were just like, oh my God, I don't know how to get around this. Like, I'm going to have to get a real job, And it made us so happy. And we were like, okay, we really have something here because we're really able to stop these guys. And then also when we finally got to the point where we had a run rate of $1 million a year, like there was a picture of us. We were at a conference, like sitting at an exhibit hall at a conference when we hit the $1 million run rate. And we were just so happy. We were like, oh my God, this is a real business. So I would say those 2 points were the main points when we knew it was going to work.
So having a business background, you did an undergrad in business. What's the journey like doing a very technical startup? And what was that path like? So you said you were dabbling in coding, trying to do technical stuff when you joined the incubator. But what you're talking about seems like a lot heavier on the technical side to me than just like a e-com side or like a simple SaaS product.
Yeah. The journey was interesting. It was not a journey that I expected for sure, because when we started, we did have technical resources at the company, thank God, because like I said, when we started, we were doing phone calls with one-time passcodes rather than text messaging. And that is extremely complicated. Like I said, you have to have, or at the time, you had to have these telecom lines hooked up to these special servers to generate the call. And so those technical resources were able to handle that. When we started doing text messaging, I would say that's when I got more involved. It wasn't just like coding. I don't even know how to explain it, but it's part of it is coding, but the telecom network is extremely complicated. So I didn't know anything about it. No one at the company really knew anything about it. So how do you survive? You have to like dig in and learn how all of this works. So it was a lot of like finding vendors, talking to them, like figuring out in your mind like what they're saying actually means, because they're not necessarily like on the level what they're telling you. And then digging into other types of vendors, like how does the telecom system work? Like who are all these providers in the background? It's not just SMS providers. It's like all of these other like lower level providers, and just figuring out how it all works. So we were piecing it together as we went. Like we were learning as we went. We would do something and then it would work for a while and then it didn't work at scale and we'd have to like go learn something else. Yeah. So we were constantly figuring out how things were working in the background. And then that would change our system a lot. Like we ended up buying a company in 2012 based out of Serbia because they had a direct telecom connection. Because we had learned so much at that point. We were like, we need to be hooked fully into like the SS7 network, which is like what undergirds all of the telecom system. And they had that connection. So we made it far from where we started, which was knowing nothing.
You mentioned you had 3 co-founders in total, including yourself, right?
Yes.
And none of you were technical or partially technical, or?
I was the most technical.
So how did you guys decide roles and responsibilities when the turning point came? We're like, okay, TeleSign is becoming the thing. We're going to like make it its own dedicated and just focus on that full time.
Yeah.
How did you guys decide and split responsibilities?
We were lucky in that the 3 of us are so different. There was never even really a question as to like what we would do, because I'm like the more technical one, focused more on like product and tech. One of us is very like people-oriented, salesy, likes to like go out and talk to the clients, never takes no for an answer. Yeah, like more of a salesy, could be CEO. And the other one is very, I would say, operational. Actually, he might be more of the CEO type because he's more operational. He likes to like move the pieces around of the company, put this person here, that person there, like org structure, all of that stuff. It just like worked out so well. It was kind of like a little miracle.
The reason I ask is co-founder conflict is one of the highest reasons of startup failure. And I think a lot of people, again, don't understand the relationship they're getting into. And it sounds like you had a really good understanding with your co-founders from early on, right? Well, whether that was by chance or by design, but it was something that happened with the incubator as well.
100%. And if I was going to do it again, I would be looking for the same type of thing. I think some people tend to look for people that are like them, but you don't really want someone like you. You want someone that you can be honest with and talk to, so they're like you in that sense, but you need completely different skills.
Yeah. I didn't know there was a thing. I went to SF in January and I met a lot of folks who are co-founder dating. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. Like folks are getting into 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, like project arrangements where like someone has an idea or they're like, hey, I want to find the right person to work with, even if it's a different idea.
Okay.
And so they're getting into like predefined engagements.
Yeah.
Like, hey, let's do this for 2-3 months, see if we vibe together or not vibe.
Yeah.
And then take the leap. And people have said even like YC applications, they focus on the co-founder relationship a lot more than whether your idea is like the best idea in the world.
Yeah, makes sense.
But no, that makes sense that building a company with the right person, I think matters a lot and can take a mediocre idea and still make it a big company. But a bad relationship can take a really good idea and just like burn it to the ground.
For sure. And which is maybe the most likely outcome too, because personalities don't always work together. I think we also worked out really well because we balanced, it wasn't just skills, it was also just like personality type. Like when I was down, my co-founders were up. When they were down, I was up. It was just like this crazy balance, but it's not easy to find that.
Makes sense. So you guys decide to go TeleSign full time. What does that transition look like? Did you move out of the incubator? Are you still affiliated with the incubator? Like, can you talk through that process a little bit?
Yeah, we did it in a very slow way. So the first thing that we did was we just took another office in the same building. It's almost like having a child and having them just sort of like move out to like the garage, the pool house or something like that.
Yeah.
We're still very close. If we needed a resource out of the incubator, we could still use it. So we had some shared resources still. But we were on our own, doing our own thing up there. Then we brought in more people, so new employees that were not from the incubator. So we had to get a bigger space. So we moved to another office, still in the same building, bigger. And then finally, we were like, okay, this is a real company. Like, we need to just totally separate. And so in order to do that, we just sort of figured out which resources it made the most sense would stay with the TeleSign and which ones would stay with the incubator. So we figured that out, and then we moved to a totally different space, totally different building, not even close to the original incubator. So it was like a real separation at that point.
When starting companies and incubators, and this is probably just more a learning question for me, how does registration work in terms of, are you guys registering a C Corp? Is the incubator doing it? Or how does the logistics work in terms of when you're building a company inside of an incubator?
Yeah.
Who technically owns? Oh, I don't know. I'm just very curious.
I think it would be different now than it was back then. So back then, our mentor handled basically all of the like nitty gritty on the legal doc side. So he dealt with the registering the C Corp. Actually, it was registered as an S Corp at first. Long story short, never make that mistake. That was a huge mistake.
So you didn't do the 83B that you're supposed to do?
We just didn't. We ended up not qualifying for the QSBS, which is, my God, the worst thing ever. So never do that. Always start as a C Corp. Yeah. So anyway, he handled the nitty gritty of that. But now I would say if you're going into an incubator with an idea yourself that you're going to work on, which I think is how incubators work more now these days, you should go in, you should already have it registered at that point.
Got it.
Actually, I would just say register as soon as possible, purely for QSBS reasons, because it has a 5-year wait on it.
Yeah. Again, QSBS is something I learned about recently. Everyone's like, oh, I got to build. And like they're focused on the idea and execution. But these small things end up screwing you later on.
Yes.
If you end up building $1 billion company, it does end up hurting you later on, right?
Yes. And it's such like a small thing. I mean, I guess depending on where you are, a lot of people are in California. So to register there is like $800 a year or something like that. So people are just like, let's wait. But my recommendation would be just suck it up and do the registration, because that starts the countdown. And then you have if things go well, it's going to make a huge difference in the end. And if you don't, it's going to be super painful. I can tell you from experience.
Cool. And so you guys are moving out, building your own teams. Do you remember key points in your scaling journey, and whether they're revenue milestones, team milestones? What was that experience like, and how did you have to grow both as an individual and sort of a leader in the company during those milestones?
Yeah, we definitely had milestones. So we actually brought in an outside CEO, which was interesting, who helped to basically to build out the team at the beginning. So he brought in people that he had worked with before and sort of formalized the organization. So I think that was a big step. At
what point was that?
That was in 2011, or late 2010, early 2011.
So before the 1 million ARR, like in the...
It was after. So we were already making, we were near 10 million a year at that point. So we had grown a fair amount at that point. So we brought him in. That was definitely, it was different, not having the three of us calling the shots, right? Although we were still heavily...
influential.
Yes. We had another client that was a big, like you would know their name, they're a huge company based out of Seattle, if that's helpful at all. And we were working with them and basically trying to convince them that the phone number could be a good account identifier, because everyone was using at the time username or email. Yeah. And we were like, why not phone number? Everyone has a phone number, basically. Text message is the most widely used technology in the world.
And they don't change as often.
Exactly. It was a novel concept at the time, but we really thought that it could be a winner. And so we were working with them, just sort of, laying out all of the reasons why they should do this. And they were finally like, okay, yeah, let's do it. And so that was like a crazy milestone because we were like, if they do it, then a bunch of other companies are going to do it and it's going to become a thing. And now it really has, which is kind of crazy. So that was a massive milestone. And it took a lot of, time and effort to sort of make the case for that. Another milestone was buying that company in Serbia, for sure. It worked out really, really well. We ended up growing a huge team out there. They ended up being the biggest office, actually, in the end. What else would be a milestone? I guess selling the company, obviously a huge milestone. And there was a lot of stuff in between, obviously, that I'm skipping over, but some of it has left my mind. I'm sure it'll get jogged at some point.
Is there any one or two points that were particular downtimes for you in this journey of building and scaling that you're like, oh, something's not going right and it just didn't?
Yeah, every day, basically. There was always something not going right. So we were a cost center for all of our clients. When you're selling a fraud prevention service, you're not helping the company make money. You're 100%. Helping them ideally avoid losing money or lose or have a reputational damage or whatever. And so our clients were always hammering us on the price. They were just like, we're spending too much, da-da-da-da. So we were always just on the edge of are they going to figure out some other way to do this? That was daily, basically.
So when there's times of economic downturn and companies are cleaning up the books and getting rid of cost centers, is fraud prevention high on the list of hey, we get rid of this first? Or is it very well protected in terms of it's one of the last things to go if we need to?
We're lucky it was one of the last things to go. They keep that, and fraud actually tends to pick up in periods of economic downturn because people find other ways to make money. And so we were lucky. 2008, we didn't even really feel it. We just chugged on along pretty much the same as it had been before. We didn't see any real sensitivity when it came to the economy, except if a business just went out of business, right? If they were no longer there. But other than that, no, we didn't see any real sensitivity.
Makes sense. After leaving the incubator, did you guys raise a lot of money outside of whatever the incubator had put in? Did you have multiple rounds to sort of grow hyperscale, or were you more or less bootstrapped and profitable throughout?
So we were bootstrapped and profitable. But in 2012, when we bought the Serbian company, we raised around, because we didn't have enough to actually purchase the company. So we raised around purely for the purpose of being able to purchase that company. And then a few years after that, we raised another round that we didn't need, to be quite frank. I was actually against raising that round, but we did it. So we did take a Series B. It was for around $50 million, and honestly didn't end up doing really anything with it. Yeah, it was, 05%. It was nothing. So, but anyways, so we did take 2 rounds, but they were, I would say, unusual rounds. They weren't to stay alive or anything like that.
They weren't runway-inducing rounds, or they weren't growth-related.
Exactly.
And the reason I ask is I just wanted to ask if there was ever any investor pressure on the decisions you guys made. Because one thing I also want to try to highlight in the episodes I'm doing is when people raise, how much of the company's trajectory changes because of investor pressure versus how much of it stays true to whatever the founder needs. But I'm guessing in this case, there wasn't a lot of investor pressure. There was no need for money. You were never in a position to need to do what the investors said. There
really wasn't much investor pressure at all, to be honest. We had board meetings. They were very positive board meetings. And in some cases, we could have used some investor pressure, to be honest with you, especially during certain times of the company. But no, we never really had much investor pressure at all. So I think, again, we're kind of an unusual case. In many ways, we got just sort of lucky with the way the business went.
Makes sense. Did the external CEO stay on until the sale of the company, or?
No, he he left, I want to say around a year before we sold the company, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, something like that. So it was a little bit before.
And then one of you guys took on CEO role, or?
So we actually had another guy come in as the CEO until we sold the company. And then after we sold the company, one of us took over as the CEO.
The reason I ask is, what made you guys decide to bring in an external person? Mm-hmm. And I know you mentioned team building and you wanted someone to build out a better team, but I'm just trying to highlight, what skill sets did you guys think you guys were missing? I'm assuming you came to some conclusions that, hey, I think we need someone who's good at X that we're not good at to bring in and
Yeah, it's a good question. And what we were thinking at the time, I would give totally different advice to people these days. So what we were thinking at the time was, we were super young. We were like early 20s at that point, or mid 20s, whatever. We were super young. And I don't know, I just feel like kids these days might not be the same as we were, but we were just like, you don't know what you need to know to 100%. Go to the next level. You can bring someone in and they know more than you, and they'll make it happen and da-da-da-da. I don't really think that's true now. I think that you could do just as well on your own with maybe some, additional mentor advisor type of help. I don't really think that we needed to bring in an external CEO, but at the time it just seemed like, well, we don't really know what we're doing. Let's bring in someone who knows what they're doing and go from there. So that's why we did it.
Makes sense. I do agree that nowadays there is a lot of access to information, mentors, advisors. Mm-hmm. I also feel like founders should understand where their skill set lies. I think on a previous episode, I was talking about, you're either good at 0 to 1 or 1 to 10 mm-hmm. or 10 to 100. Maybe you're good at 2 of these, mm-hmm. but it's very hard to be good at 0 to 1 billion.
For sure.
Because they're very different skill sets. But after a time, it becomes about scalable systems and orgs, and not about product market fit and customer mentality. And if you understand where you lie, mm-hmm. you can bring in the systems in place when you need to. One thing I wanted to ask was, during the journey, at what point did you guys decide to want to sell, and why did that come on the table?
It's a really good question. And I think that people will always second guess the decisions that you make, right? Without getting into too much detail, we had a lot of sort of internal drama at the company at a certain point, and it was getting more and more difficult to get things done in a positive way. Because of that, frankly, our revenue was sort of plateauing. We were just like, what's going to happen with this company? It always seemed like every day just seemed like an existential crisis at some point. And we were like, okay, we need to figure out what we're going to do with this. I mean, we had already been in it for starting in 2005 to 2017 when we sold us 12 years. That's a long time to be in a company. Yeah. Literally from starting basically day one. Well, starting the day we started doing SMS, people were just like, well, SMS is going to die. Everyone's going to be using, first it was Skype, and then it was WhatsApp and da-da-da. It just always seemed like something was going to put the company out of business, could happen any day. And so we were just like, okay, let's take it off the table. Our entire net worth is basically tied up in this one company that we've been working on forever. If it goes out of business, we're going to have a real...
And I'm assuming no one's taken secondaries at this point.
No. We did take a little off the table at one point, but it wasn't that much. Yeah. And so we were just like, we cannot continue this way with all of this stress.
Makes sense.
So that's why we decided to look around and see if there was anything out there, anyone who would want to do a purchase.
How does that process go about? Do you call a broker, a bank? I have no idea how that goes about.
We used an investment banker, essentially, that did sort of run a process. But we also, talked to clients, talked to vendors, talked to whoever, sort of reach out inside the industry and softly let it be known. You don't want to tell the world. Yeah. So we talked to various people about whether it could be interesting.
I listened to a couple of podcasts where they talk about negotiations, and one of the things they say is, whoever can be the most uncomfortable in the room is probably going to get what they want out of the negotiation.
That sounds right.
If the other person knows that, hey, you guys are looking for an exit, they can probably strong arm you, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that. It's true. And it was not an easy process either. It took a full year to sell. Once we had a buyer, it took a full year to actually sell the company. There was a lot of due diligence involved. There was a lot of we're saying this client is going to sign in August. Do they actually sign in August?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And we actually also went through a CFIUS process, which, oh my God,
Which process?
It's called CFIUS. It's if you get purchased by a foreign company.
Got it.
You or that company can decide to go through this process where you basically get approval by the US government for the sale. And because we were bought by a Belgian telecom, which is extremely conservative, and they're buying a cybersecurity company, more or less, they were like, well, we don't want it to get unwound later because the US government decides that there can't be a foreign owner of a cybersecurity company.
Yeah.
So we're going to do the CFIUS process. So you submit and you ask the US government, like, can you please give your approval and say that you're not ever going to come back later and change your mind? And so we did that, and it took, I don't even remember. There was a first round. It was like 3 months, and then they're like, okay, we have to extend it. It went to 6 months. And then at the day before that 6 month, they said they were going to approve it. The next day, they said they changed their mind and they weren't going to approve it. And we had to reapply. And the amount of stress during this process, because you don't know what's going on. They don't give you feedback, like why
the
they're
U.S.
not approving
government
it.
is known for no visibility.
Exactly. So we're just like, oh my God, it was extremely stressful.
And is the onus on you to get that approval, or is it on the buying company to get the approval?
It's on whoever can make it happen. And either one.
Also, you're more incentivized to...
I think both sides are pretty incentivized. So we didn't care, actually, if they did the CFIUS process. They're the ones that decided that they wanted to do it. And then once they decided they wanted to do it and submitted, then it was on both of us to get it done.
It makes sense.
But like how you do that is another question, you know, unless you have a direct line into the State Department, there's not a whole lot that you can do.
And is this a very common process, or is it because it's the first time I've heard of this?
I mean, if you get purchased by a U.S. company, then no, you never have to do that. It's only if you get purchased by a foreign company, so it's not so common, and it wouldn't even be for just like some random company getting purchased. It's more like if you have something that could be important to U.S. interests. So like cybersecurity is one, and there's various others.
Got it. Makes sense. So you guys decide to sell, you find a buyer, it takes a year in the process. Is the company growing at that point? Is the company more like, where is your guys' energy during this process?
I mean, we signed a couple of really large clients during that process, so that was great. There was a lot of energy that went into the due diligence, but the company was still quite functional at the time because it was big. It wasn't like 20 people or something trying to make it happen. There was hundreds of people. It kept ticking along. Like, it didn't really feel like we were taking the eye off the ball so much as it would if you had a smaller company or trying to go through this.
Makes sense. And during the sale, did all of you guys have to stay on? I know in most sales, there's like, hey, stay on for 2 years, 3 years sort of arrangement. Is the founding team staying on, or what kind of deal did you guys come to?
There was basically... I'm going to forget the technical term for this, but like where they, if you hit certain milestones after the sale,
you vest more equity or whatever.
It was just a direct payment. Yeah. So it was like you could stay on up to 3 years, or that those targets were up to 3 years out, I should say, but you only got it if you stayed on, right? So one of us, Darren, left after 6 months, a year. He was the first to leave. I stayed on for the full 3 years, and then Ryan, who was the operational guy, stayed on. He was the CEO at that point and stayed on a little bit after me.
Got it.
We actually stayed a fair amount of time. I was enjoying seeing the integration because it's just another part of the process that you don't get to see before you get bought, like how this big company works, how they're going to integrate you, if it's going to work out, like how the companies are going to work together. And it was interesting to see it play out.
What was it like to go from being co-founder, sort of leading a company, to being bought out now, technically having a boss, but also being on the other side of, you're not on the hook as much for the growth, but you're also a little like, I mean, you're sort of in between, but what was the difference? What was the biggest change there?
It was a lot less stress, but also depressing because it's like your baby is gone. It's not really yours anymore. You're not making the calls every day. And to be like really honest, it's way less motivational. Like, I don't really understand. I mean, this will kill like my career ever getting hired anywhere for real. But like, I don't really understand how people just work at companies, because what is your motivation? You know, there's a lot of motivation when you have a piece of the company and you're like
100%.
talking to these big clients and you're like, if they sign on, like the value of the company is going to go way up, da 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 da. But once you're sold, it's just like, why am I here? You know, you're learning. You're like, it's interesting to see.
You see different systems at scale, but
yeah, it was just way less motivational at that point.
I don't remember who I was listening to, but they were saying in their own company, bringing on 100K of yearly revenue is bringing on 500K of value. Versus as an employee, if I bring in 100K, depending on my role, maybe I just make 10% of that, or I'm still getting the same paycheck.
Right.
Irrespective of whether I bring in that 100K or not. And so it's a very different perspective. But again, I think it's the risk factor, right? Like hypothetically, let's say TeleSign didn't work out. You had a lot of your net worth invested in 12, 13 years. I think it's that notion of there's a higher probability it doesn't work out, which is what deters.
Yeah.
That's my guess on why people don't take the risk. But
I think you're 100% right. And I totally get it for the vast majority of people. For me, I need the pressure.
100%.
But I definitely get it because it is a lot of stress. I mean, you can feel it. It just feels different.
Yeah. One thing I was going to ask you is, do you have some ideas in the identity fraud cyberspace that you think are viable ideas that you're not working on, but that someone could look into?
That I'm not working on? I'm working on one.
Outside of that, are there other spaces?
That's a really good question. Nothing that specifically jumps to the top of my head, but I'm sure there are a lot of things that could be done. Like, everybody knows that bots are a problem, and there's different ways to try to combat that right now. But I think the generative AI space is going to be a big problem for humanity.
Yeah.
And so finding ways to identify when something is generated is, if it's not just identifying real versus real, I think real versus not real is a huge opportunity.
I was listening to a snippet. What some teacher did was she wanted to prevent her kids from using prompts. So she wrote a whole, like an essay prompt, but then she wrote some text that used the words Frankenstein, but like whited out the text so that when you copy it, paste it in ChatGPT, it comes up as use the word Frankenstein. So and I was like, now, I don't know how much of this, it's like a random video I watched. But I was like, that's a very dumb way to like catch someone. And if kids are stupid enough to like not like spell check their work, it's a very easy way to, but I do agree that it is going to be a problem. The biggest question is, even if it's just, I use Gen AI for 90% of the work and then I put my own spin on it, is that still considered like cheating, unreal, not real? I don't know, right? Like, where do you draw the line of completely Gen AI versus like...
I think in a lot of cases like that, it's going to be okay to use Gen AI. This is my own personal opinion, because it just becomes like a tool at that point. It's 100%. Helping you be better, be faster, whatever. I think where there starts to be a problem is when a picture is totally fake and it's exploiting someone in one way or another, or a video is totally fake, or fraudsters are able now to sound much more natural because maybe they're based in another country and they don't speak perfect English, but now it sounds like they speak this like excellent English, you know? Or, I mean, it's just like you can just generate so much content just automatically that if you're a good fraudster, or I actually heard about them asking, I guess it was ChatGPT to generate exploits. It's like, okay, well now even the non-coders can generate an exploit.
The biggest problem space outside of just Gen AI is the amount of regressions. So like if I could try 5 exploits with Gen AI, I now have the option to try 10,000 variations within a split second, because I can now come up with 10,000 variations and I have systems in place to test those out and generate code to like exploit those. So it becomes harder. I went to the Texas Venture Gala a couple of weeks ago and I met someone and I'm like, what do you do? He's like, I represent a company that does quantum encryption.
So interesting.
And I was like, what's that? He's like, with the level of supercomputers we have today, if we go one level above, you can basically decrypt anything. But like someone's looking into it. Someone cares about this, right? So
well, and it sounds like my takeaway from that is that it's needed now. Like, you should actually start doing quantum encryption on your stuff now, not to like be a spokesperson for this person, but basically it sounds like there are people, countries, like various entities that are just sucking down large amounts of encrypted information, knowing that they can't crack it now, but that eventually, they'll be able to. And God knows like what information is in there that they'll be able to use at that point.
My take on all of this is just try not to be a target for someone.
Yes, 100%.
Because I fundamentally believe that if someone wants to break into whatever I have, I can't do much to stop them.
No.
So my goal is like just not to be a target.
Yeah.
I'm no one important. I'm just someone on the side.
It's a good strategy. Security by obscurity, they call it.
I didn't know there was a term. Okay.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask was, you've been running TeleSign for almost 12 years plus more as advisor capacity. What's been your support system throughout?
It was really my two co-founders. I got so lucky with them. They were so great. We had a WhatsApp chat group. We still have it. We still chat quite often. And we were just constantly on that, talking about, whatever we need to talk about. Of course, I have my family, parents, I have a dog, I have friends. But really, it's hard for people to understand what you're going through if they're not in it. Maybe if they're a co-founder of a company, they can like understand. But other than that, it's such like different problems than most people have on a daily basis that really having those two was super, super important and helpful.
What are 3 resources that you would recommend to founders who are building today? And this could be podcasts, books, resources, anything. And if they're specific to the identity fraud cyberspace, better. But if not, that's also fine.
I just feel like everyone has it so easy today. I don't even really have 3 specific resources. I would just say to anyone out there, you're so lucky because you have things like AWS that you can build on top of, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, whatever, all of them. And like all of the ones that make it even easier than that now, like Vercel and all of these different platforms that we had none of. Just be happy that you have those things. And then just such a wealth of resources as far as, and I don't really have any specific ones, just like all of the podcasts like this that you can listen to and get advice. And even just like LinkedIn as a resource too. People maybe underestimate it or maybe they don't. I don't know. But just being able to reach out, find the people who have knowledge in your space, reach out to them, hit them cold, get feedback from them. A lot of times people do want to help and like they will respond. And even if it's like not a ton of help, they'll, in many cases, give good feedback. So I would just say take advantage of everything that's out there because they're used to it. It hasn't always been like this. There wasn't always so much information available.
One thing I try to do is if there's folks who are like very cold connections, I'll send a cold DM and I'll just send updates every once in a while. Like, hey, here's hey, great episode. Or like, I saw that.
Yeah.
With no intention of ever expecting anything. And if there ever is a reply, then I can be like, hey, I would love your take on blah, 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 right?
I was going to say one other thing our top sales guy used to do back in the day. He was a freaking genius. He would go on LinkedIn and basically straight up stalk people and see like what their normal posting cadence is and how often they were connecting to people. And then he would know if they stopped connecting for like a week, he'd be like, they must be on vacation. I'm going to leave them alone right now. Or he'd be like, oh, they just connected to a recruiter. They're going to jump to another company. I need to make better connections beyond them. Like if you get creative, the amount of stalking you can do and really figure out like when the best time to reach out to people is and stuff like that. It's really interesting.
I met a guy in Austin who's building a LinkedIn-based HR tech company, which basically works with recruiters and tells them if your employees are looking elsewhere. Yeah. And it's all inference-based.
Yep.
But hiring an employee is expensive.
Yep.
And onboarding them is expensive. And so if they're looking within 6 months, you want to try to figure out why.
Right.
And so I'm like, it's a very interesting take on trying to do like behavior analysis of like, okay, so what is this guy doing? Like, is he looking for jobs? Like, why is he like, what's the problem? Like, go try to plug that leak instead of.
So valuable. Yeah.
the amount of data available, I think there's a lot of stuff that people can do. It's just, I think, a matter of how do you take action. You consume a lot, like I consume a lot of data, but I think it also comes down to what of those can I take and then take action on and actually build something out of, right?
100%. And you have to be really good at sorting data now too, because there's such an overload and you don't necessarily know who knows what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Because some people feels like they're
Thought
just
leaders.
Right. And they're just kind of generating content. They always need new topics.
Yeah.
And like, who knows if they, if any of what they're saying actually works or whatever.
Yeah. I constantly keep deleting my YouTube history because you realize over time that your YouTube feed will be very catered to the kinds of stuff you click on. And I just did it yesterday, and like now I'm seeing videos that I never saw on my feed before.
That's so smart.
And so I just, like every couple of weeks, I'll just delete my full watch history.
Yeah.
So that I can get completely new.
That's such a good idea.
Watch a couple too many EDC videos, everyday carrier, and now my whole feed is just everyday carrier videos all of a sudden. But yeah. One other question I had was, what was your startup stack, or what is your current startup stack at this Dell company? What tools are you using to build out the company?
I mean, just on the tech side, like I'm pretty old school. I don't really do all of the new fancy stuff. So we're just starting to build. And so our backend is going to be like Python, the basic stuff. Python with like a relational database. Like I freaking hate NoSQL database. Anyway, that's a whole other, that's the first thing developers want to use. They're like, we're going to use some kind of new JavaScript tech and a NoSQL database. I'm like, well, how am I going to look through that and find patterns? It's like nearly impossible. Anyways, yeah, we'll have a pretty basic tech stack. And then just as far as everything else, I mean, again, I'm pretty old school. I use like OneNote to like organize things. I know everyone uses Notion now. I like OneNote, stuff like that. I don't know, AWS and just the basics, nothing too crazy.
It's funny. I've had some founders on who are like, I'm just a Google Drive person.
Right.
Like just everything Google Suite, Google Drive, Google Docs, and like Evernote. And I'm like, okay, like simple stack.
Yeah.
You can get super efficient and do like Zapier automations, but I think it's very like person dependent.
Yeah.
Too many tools. Like I've tried Notion a lot and I feel like it's too much.
Right.
At the end of the day, I just want a very simple system. And every Notion template just complicates one. Like I need this, and then I have a subfolder and a project folder, and this folder, and then I have a task folder, and then a reminder folder.
Yeah.
I link my calendar, and then it's too like much. I'm a pen and paper person. I just walk around with a notebook and I cross stuff off, and
what works for you. For me. Yeah. And like every now and then, like you tried Notion, like you try the new things, and it's not like you're just like, oh, I'm never going to use anything else, but you try it and you're like, this just doesn't work for me. Like I already have my system and it works really well and da-da-da.
The only caveat of pen and paper is I can't search and look back.
Well, you can get the new high-tech pen and paper.
Remarkable and stuff.
Yeah. So it'll go.
It's one more thing to carry around, though.
That's true. That is true. I used to have a pen and paper. I don't remember what this was called, but it was pretty neat. It was like really cool. It was a notepad that had like actual paper, and it was a pen, but it recorded everything that you wrote.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And then that went into OneNote or whatever, wherever you wanted to put it, and then it was searchable. So you had both. So if you're the kind of person that wants to search for stuff by words, you can do it. Or if you're the kind of person that remembers like where you wrote something, then you can do that too, which was great. Really like that.
Sweet. I do this segment where I ask every guest a last question. Your question is, what are you afraid of, and what's holding you back from the reality you think can exist?
Ooh, that one is so deep. What am I afraid of? I'm afraid of not reaching my potential, which is kind of where that question is going, I feel like. But maybe everyone sort of has this feeling that like you can do this or that in life, and are you on the track to get there? And it's hard to know if you are on that track or not, right? So that's my like fear.
What's holding you back from the reality you think can exist?
I don't really know. Twitter? Maybe like spending a little bit too much time keeping up with what's like the world events. Yeah. There's just so much going on. And sometimes I feel like I just need to cut myself like off from everything that's happening. And you never really know like what's really happening. Yeah. Is it really a big deal, or is it just the same thing that's been happening for hundreds of years, but we just didn't know about it? So maybe like overthinking, like paying too much attention to the world. But other than that, I don't really feel like I have like a fear that's holding me back necessarily.
It's a good place to be in.
Yeah, I guess. Or maybe I'm just delusional and there is, and I'm not identifying it.
That's also a good place to be. Like the naiveness of just, hey, this is going to work and I'm going to build it and it's going to make sense, right?
Right.
I feel like sometimes founders, at least like personally, I get stuck in analysis paralysis of like, I know too much about why something won't work.
Sure.
And I won't go do it because I'm like, here's 10 reasons I know this is going to fail.
Right.
And so I'm not going to go start it. But like, maybe I just need to go start it and not worry about those 10 things, right?
It's such a balance because like maybe it won't work. You don't want to waste time on it. But at the same time, like if we had any clue what we were doing at TeleSign at the beginning, there's no way we would have done it. We would have never like started and gone down that path. Something that was so difficult and we didn't really know the industry. And, everyone who was already in the industry was just like, this is stupid. It's never going to work.
You got to be naive to disrupt.
You do. You do. Our mentor used to say something along the lines of like, you have to be crazy or stupid to do this, which is probably pretty true.
What's a question you have for a future guest?
I would say like, what was the most transformational experience that happened to you in a business sense, like at your business?
Makes sense.
Was there something that happened that really changed your perspective from one day to the next?
Do you have an answer to that?
I think for me, it was very much the experience with the big client when they said yes to the like phone as an identifier. It was just like, oh my God, we can actually convince these giant companies to totally change the way they're doing something and really like and it impacts like millions or billions of people. It's crazy.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. But thank you for coming on. That's all the questions I had for you. Where can listeners find you? Is there anything you want to plug? Anything you want to tell them about? And we can link everything in the description.
I have no plugs. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's basically it. I don't really do social media like a normal person. The thing about being in cybersecurity is you're just like, you don't really want to have all of your information out there. You get pretty sensitive to that stuff.
One of the biggest hurdles I had of starting this podcast was I'm not a social media person. I don't post anywhere. But I was like, okay, if I'm going to put myself out there, it's like a big change and now I don't know what someone can do with video and voice. You can do deepfakes and stuff. Again, I just don't want to be a target.
Right.
But it's part of the I mean,
what can you do?
Yeah, what can you do? But that was a big hurdle. I'm like, I mean, if someone really wants to do something, they're gonna do it irrespective of
that's true.
Whether I do this podcast or not.
I don't know. It is a big mental change to like be sort of totally in the background, which is one thing I always really liked about TeleSign is people like, they were like, oh, I've done that before, but I didn't know there was a company, versus the podcast. You're out in public and speaking to people. So big change.
But yeah, we'll link everything in the description. But thank you for coming on. It was an amazing conversation.
Awesome. Really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for tuning into Funds and Founders. If you're a local Austin founder, a venture capitalist, or just someone who's building and in the middle of their journey and would like to be featured on an upcoming episode, submit your guest pitch to abhinavsinha.podcast@gmail.com. If you have a founder-specific event you'd like to promote on the podcast, you can also reach out to me. If you want to continue to get support through your founder journey, hit the follow button and I'll see you in the next episode.